Hi, Gwilym. How are you? I was going to say this fine day, but it's actually chucking it down outside here.
It's clammy. It's good. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
You're clammy.
No, it's clammy. I'm
Oh,
fine.
it's clammy. Anything exciting happened in your life recently?
I was hoping you'd ask me that, actually. I was reflecting. Do you remember we were talking the other day, and we both been a bit grumpy about being in the office and how we can get everything we need to do done at home, right?
Yeah.
I think we were both kind of had a little moment on that. I was in the office last week because we're going in a couple of days a week. And I sat down in a little communal space, and some other people sat at the next table. And I had a reminder about one of the many reasons it's actually quite good to be back in the office. The smell,
the smell of people?
No? They smell great. They smell good. No, it wasn't the smell, though. I thought, they had a banana. Actually, the banana's relevant. I'll come back to that. Yeah, I caught a little glimpse of someone else's conversation that, you don't get at home. You don't get glimpses of conversation. And it was this. Somebody was saying to the table, it was a bloke, obviously, saying to the table, and the second way is that you put it next to a banana.
So is that like ripening something?
Do you know what? You're a lot quicker than me, because I was thinking, I didn't want to go there. You see, what I wanted to do was to say, what's the first way? So you're halfway there, by the way, Lee, but we've got to get the whole way. I asked him, rather than finding out what they're talking about, because that's boring, I actually said, I heard you saying about the second way. What's the first way?
Take it off the vine and put it on the windowsill.
I need to sit next to you and catch your glimpses of confidence. No, it wasn't. It was put it upside down.
Oh, now I'm confused.
Yeah, no, but you were right. It was like ripening. But what was it about ripening of? Do you know?
What was it ripening of? So I immediately went to tomatoes, which is where there was to take them off the vine and put them on the windowsill. But you don't put tomatoes upside down. What could you put upside down? What's got an up and a down when it comes to the world of fruit and veg?
Well, a lot of them do. I mean, look at pears. But then again, pears would fall over. Look, pointy things are going to fall over. You can't put them upside down. That's a good point.
So I'm trying to... Strawberry. A strawberry.
Good, but no. Shall I tell you?
How many guesses have I got?
I think there are 19 different ways of doing this. I don't know. I shall tell you, because
Tell me.
It's not a podcast about fruit. Pineapples.
How just had a pineapple upside down?
He's got that. I don't know which way up, which is the right way. I guess on the bushy bit. People not visual can't see what I'm doing with my hand to represent the bushy bit of a pineapple, but it's like a kind of a spider. That was quite interesting. Then my daughter said that she ripens bananas but put them in the oven, which cannot be right. I think that's cooking, not ripening.
We did have we had a banana fall down the back of an oven incident last year, and it took me a while to take the cook. I really couldn't be bothered to take the cooker out. So when I eventually took it out, this banana was about that big.
And what happens?
It had just shrunk down. It still looked like a banana,
like a jalapeno banana.
It was like a jalapeno banana. Yeah.
Good Lord. Yeah. A jalapeno.
Yeah. I didn't eat it because there were also lots of mouse droppings around it and things. So I probably thought it was best left alone.
What in your cooker? Well, you got mice in your cooker. Nobody has mice in food. You don't get mice in your cooker.
They're not in my cooker. They're behind my cooker.
Lee Davis and Gwilym Roberts are the two IPs in a pod, and you are listening to a podcast on intellectual property, brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys.
Okay. Anyway, we probably ought to get on with the podcast, shouldn't we?
Yeah, well, I think we are.
Yeah, but not least because we've got guests from overseas today, and they're probably thinking to themselves, "What the hell have we let ourselves in for? what are we doing here?" So we've got Mark and Jennifer with us, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, if that's okay with them. So should we go with Jennifer first? Only because Mark said that he wasn't going to let her get a word in edgewise when we were prepping for this. So
is there any chance, Jennifer? Get in.
Okay, quick. I'm going to jump in. I'm Jennifer Brant, and I run a small consulting business in Geneva, Switzerland, and I work on a range of intellectual property and trade policy matters. And I'm delighted to be here. Mark and I have just co-authored a report called Unprecedented, and I'm very excited to present it to you.
Fabulous. It's great that you can join us, Jennifer. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Mark, who are you? What are you doing here?
Well, I'm not an expert in bananas, being allergic to them. So I'll just have to talk about intellectual property. I'm an intellectual property law professor. I'm actually the Goodyear Endowed Chair in Intellectual Property Law at the University of Akron. I've taught intellectual property law for about 20 years, and I was a practicing lawyer doing intellectual property and technology law for about a decade before that. So I was really happy to work on this report with Jen. It was a great opportunity to talk to some really interesting people at the center of this historical moment in the fight against COVID.
Yeah, so it's fantastic you can join us. So so the podcast goes out to SEPA members, so you can have a lot of patent attorneys listen to this. So sometimes you're going to have to keep it sort of like quite dry and detail laden. But we also go out to the wider inventor community, and we've got all kinds of listeners. So you can make it a bit sexy at times if you want to. You know, you can sort of feel able to sex up the dossier if you really want to.
There might be some people are more interested in the banana allergy than anything else, actually. So let's just cover that one off quickly. Is that like a major fruit allergy? Is it mostly bananas? Where does it stop?
Oh, it's so many things. Cantaloupes, watermelons. It's quite difficult in the summer.
Well, we're sad to hear that, but yes. So I'll stop ambushing. Lee, you had a sensible question.
Shall I kick off with the sensible questions? And Gwilym, just come in whenever you feel like you want to ruin the podcast. Is that all right?
I thought I'd done a good job already, but I'll carry on.
So I thought we would start by just sort of setting the scene, if that's okay, with both of you. Tell us a little bit about the research, why you embarked on it. Maybe touch on what it was about the pandemic that set us challenges that we'd never seen before. That's quite exciting. Not just for the pharma industry, but also in terms of the intellectual property system. So just kind of ground us in the research.
Okay, I can take that one. So, I mean, stating the obvious, there had never really been before a health problem affecting every single person in the world at one time, right? And the R&D system, the manufacturing systems that were in place were just really not equipped to deal with such a challenge at first glance. And so that's, I mean, the scale of the problem and the urgency of the problem, having a global pandemic, I think is what made that situation so unusual, unprecedented, if you will.
Yeah, I think another thing about it was that it seemed at first that we might not be up to the challenge, that we had to move so fast, and really everybody did that was responsible. People really felt the weight of history, and I think one amazing thing we saw is that our institutions were ready for it in some ways. There were ways some of our institutions let us down, but I'd say not intellectual property. And that was, that was not clear. There were many critics who immediately said, not later on, but immediately started to say intellectual property is going to stop us from sharing the information we need to properly properly develop a treatment or to develop a vaccine. And then at every stage, well, intellectual property, we have a vaccine candidate, but intellectual property will prevent us from quickly developing it. Intellectual property will prevent us from manufacturing it. This is kind of the story throughout those 2 years I've worked on this issue. So the critics were largely wrong, and very much so. The intellectual property actually facilitated people working together quickly, which we really, yes, my priors inclined me to believe that would be the case, but talking to some of the key players in this battle really demonstrated that to us. And that was fairly exciting to hear and fascinating.
I guess just to add something too, I mean, it's easy to forget how things were in that moment, right? If you look back, there were incredible pressures on supply chains, quarantines physically of people. I live in Switzerland, and we've got a lot of people every day crossing the border from the neighboring countries to staff the production lines for healthcare technologies in Switzerland. And those people suddenly were blocked with the closed border from getting to where they needed to be. So even problems like that had to be solved. Countries were putting in place export controls. So in addition to the scale and urgency of the pandemic itself, you had a very difficult innovation environment, very difficult environment to operate within.
So is the report, is it a tour d'horizon? So you're kind of looking at everything that happened, or are you drawing conclusions? Is there a thesis behind it? What's the shape of it?
Yeah, so we set out to look at what the role of IP had been in the innovation response to the pandemic. And we looked only at things were evolving so rapidly that we ended up looking at the first 18 months of the pandemic, and we cut off our research on August 1st of 2021.
Yeah, and it was our approach was that we understand that intellectual property doesn't exist to create lawsuits, although sometimes many patent litigators forget that point. It exists for purposes of promoting investment and collaboration as well as innovation. And so we set out to understand how, what role intellectual property played at each step, with of innovation, collaboration, investment in manufacturing. We knew anecdotally and because of our, as I said, some of our prior understandings that this would be the case. But seeing how it played out was really interesting, right? Because we also know that intellectual property doesn't do things on its own. Intellectual property, you need good trust between parties. You need great science. You need some government investment in basic research. You need a solid legal system that protects contracts. And you just need a lot of hard work and expertise to pull this off. So seeing how all these different things happened and all the different ingredients that went into success at every step was really revealing here. And I think I came away with a slightly enhanced respect for the IP system, despite being a big proponent of it for my entire professional life.
Well, I think you're amongst friends here, but we are also conscious about. We know very well about the other side of the story. We've been hearing that, and indeed we've done a podcast on aspects of this in the past, and we're going to come to some of those issues. But before we do, let's see some definitions. We love legal backgrounds. We're talking about IP here, intellectual property. That has got a whole bunch of facets, as we all know. It goes everywhere from patents to trade secrets and everywhere else in between. But it's also sometimes it confuses people as to whether it's an exclusive right or whether it's just the knowledge that you hold. I think it's not well defined. When you looked at IP, were you looking at the whole spectrum? Where did you focus?
We really focused on patents and trade secrets. That is know-how, let's say, and especially a big emphasis of our research was really on the establishment of the manufacturing networks that were necessary to make enough doses for everybody in the world. And there we were really looking at a lot of the transfer of knowledge, working side by side, teaching the counterpart. So really know-how. That was really essential to manufacturing. And then, of course, looking at the licensing of patented technologies.
So many of your members and listeners know that it takes a long time to get a patent, relatively. Some countries it takes forever. Not in the UK or the US or the European Patent Office, but even in the length of this pandemic, despite expedited patent applications, patents on the COVID treatments weren't really the issue. There were applications at the time. People were applying for them as they developed the technology, but patents played a key role early on, right? Patents played a key role in enabling the establishment of companies like Moderna and BioNTech that developed the mRNA vaccines. They were essential to the technology transfer that happened from Oxford to AstraZeneca. And so patents were always essential, playing that key role in translating research initially from the lab into commercial entities that had did the applied research. And because they provided the security for the investment, the many billions of dollars that went into these companies that supported their development of the technological platform, particularly the mRNA vaccine platform, over the course of a decade. And we're just lucky as a global society that technology platform was ready to support the quick development of mRNA vaccines. It's kind of an overnight success story, probably 40 or 50 years in the making, because there was so much basic research and investment, commercial investment that went into developing these platforms that just happened to be ready when we needed them. And then there was specific application of that technology to mRNA vaccines that then, initially a lot of that collaboration was founded on the confidence created by effective trade secret protection.
I've spent a career watching patents form a really important part of bringing innovation to market and stimulating it and incentivizing it, everything like that. But I mean, you've obviously got your naysayers who had concerns that, I think maybe myths, I don't know, about patents blocking the waiver development, the vaccine development or the vaccine distribution. Did we actually see that kind of activity? Was there much in the way of patents just being used in that really quite evil way?
So I think one helpful thing is for us to tell you how we structured the report and the research. It might be like a kind of nice introductory element. We looked at the pre-existing technologies that the innovators could draw on when the pandemic started. We looked at the collaborations and other efforts that went into developing the new vaccines and treatments for COVID once the pandemic was underway. And then we looked at the establishment of the manufacturing networks. So we looked at the role of IP and how people used their patents and trade secrets during those three phases of innovation, and then manufacturing and distribution. And no, we didn't see the evil uses. What we saw was really interesting, though, because we interviewed so many senior people from the companies that led this effort to develop the vaccines initially. We heard stories like, NDAs being put in place in 3 days so that work could begin on, figuring out how to manufacture the mRNA platform at scale. Conference calls organized rapidly with, 300 people to really quickly hammer out an agreement that would enable the sharing of technology and know-how. So what we saw happening at all of three of those stages that I mentioned was companies coming forward and feeling comfortable collaborating even with their competitors because they knew they had a solid IP protection they had for their technology and know-how, so they could share that without losing control over it. And the company could exist on the other side of the pandemic.
So it's pretty memorable. We quote this in the report. We talked to some of the top lawyers for Pfizer. And I remember the assistant general counsel of Pfizer, who was in charge of the IP portfolio on the vaccines, Matt Pugmire, noted that BioNTech and Pfizer had a relationship. So they had been working on some potential innovations before the pandemic. But once the pandemic started early in March 2020, they came together. And they started working together before they had reached a complete agreement. And as Matt said, he said, I don't think he says, I understand that BioNTech could not have done that without the intellectual property system, and implicit in what he was saying is we're a big giant. BioNTech was a startup. BioNTech, he even said, BioNTech was giving us their crown jewels. BioNTech was telling us, some of their most, important secrets, sharing their most important know-how. And if you're going to do that with a very large company, that's quite perilous. But the intellectual property system made it safe. So for the benefit of all of us, really, they started working together before they had cemented an entire agreement, knowing that the intellectual property system would protect BioNTech and would protect whatever Pfizer was contributing. And of course, they did come to an agreement within a week. That's some of the amazing things that happen. We lawyers know that things don't tend to usually happen at quite at that speed in most instances. But it was really over and over again, we kept hearing that how intellectual property established the trust needed for collaboration. Sharing information with researchers. Researchers would call up a company with an existing treatment and say, we have some thoughts of, we have some indications that your pre-existing therapeutic might be useful for treating COVID. And what happened is some of the big pharma companies, they quickly entered into confidentiality agreements and shared data with these researchers, gave them access to some of their most important proprietary data about these treatments so that these researchers could then more effectively test and try to develop, treatments from pre-existing therapeutics. So over and over again, we just kept hearing about how, intellectual property helped people collaborate, which is sometimes, I think, goes against the grain of what intellectual properties attorneys sometimes understand IP to do. Sometimes they're taught, it's a right to exclude, and you're in court all the time trying to defend your client's IP rights. But that's the exception. The rule is that every day intellectual property brings people together for beneficial collaborations, and no more beneficial or important than in the fight against COVID.
As we speak, the UK government is revisiting its position on a vaccine patent waiver. We don't know how that will go. CEPA has a stated position on that. And so far, the government's been in line with our position. The government's not seen the IP system as being a threat to either the vaccine development or its rollout. But there's a huge amount of political pressure, all-party political pressure, trying to make the government change its mind. So everything you've said, Mark and Jennifer, makes sense to me. Everything I've heard, yeah, IP at the very heart of this as an enabler, as a force for good. Why do we have this political narrative that says IP is bad in this context? Where does it come from? That might be a wholly unfair question to ask you, but
it's a long existing discussion, and I think sometimes it's very ideological and based on differing worldviews. Sometimes it's very pragmatic and based on strategic interests. So I think there are many NGOs who are working, and some of them I give credit to. Some of them are deeply involved in humanitarian efforts, and so if there's a new medicine and you want to use it in the field for people and you believe it's too expensive at that moment, you want it right away, and you're rather impatient with people like Professor Schultz who want to tell you that, that the important thing is dynamic incentives, that 10 years that medicine will be available to everybody without a patent, and the reason it costs more now is it helps support the development of even more innovative medicines over the next few decades. If you're trying to save somebody's life, you may be impatient with that. So I think that's where part of the impetus comes from. But part of it, I think, is often strategic. Some countries and some of their industries see it as beneficial to them to have a weaker IP system because it will help them, meet some of their strategic goals. So I think in international forums, you get a mixture of ideological opposition and countries kind of cloaking national interests in the language of ideology in order to, attempt to gain some sort of strategic advantage.
As you say, 2 years on, what an astonishing story the development is. They did it. We did it. Well, they're not we did it. They did it. Quite incredible. And really interesting I think it's a great time to look at it while it's fresh in everyone's minds as well. And I mean, you talked about your different phases of your report, the pre-existing technology, the collaborations, and the establishment of the manufacturing network. So you kind of covered off the first two, and how IP was a positive facilitator of kind of allowing people to collaborate using the pre-existing technology, which is again what the story is, Mark, as you say. It's not just an exclusive right, it's a way of, it's currency, isn't it? It's currency and ideas, if you like.
Exactly.
Yeah. But there's a third one, and this is where perhaps a lot of the arguments, this is where perhaps have come under most attack, is the kind of the vaccine inequality that did happen. We know that some countries have got too many vials and other countries have just not got anything. And patents, I think, that's where a lot of blame has been aimed, I think, at the IP system as well. That is kind of what happened there. Is there any merit in that area there? Is that why the vaccine waiver might be a thing?
Well, I think there are two things to unpack there. One is just what was all the manufacturing capacity utilized? Was it all used throughout the world, or were people hoarding knowledge to themselves and not sharing? And that's part of the collaboration story, is that in order to manufacture, none of the manufacturers of the leading vaccines had the capacity to manufacture these on their own. They all had to turn to partners to manufacture them. And in several instances, they worked with some of their biggest competitors and taught them how to make the vaccine. So Sanofi did not have its own innovative vaccine. It tried, but it didn't work. But they did work with they worked with both Pfizer, and they worked with AstraZeneca, I believe, as well. And so there were many instances of that, of nobody was, what companies were really doing was desperately looking for manufacturing partners that would be able to meet their needs through, the quality that had sufficient quality control expertise and facilities to work with. And there was this kind of story that there was manufacturing capacity ready and waiting. But it was sort of labeled as, manufacturing capacity, as if something with the right label on it could then take and make a sophisticated modern vaccine. Just because you have a vaccine facility doesn't mean it's ready and able to do mRNA vaccines, for example, any more than, say, a car, a factory that makes gasoline, powered motors for automobiles could quickly switch to making electric motors. It's not necessarily the same technology. It's not necessarily capacity that's available, at least not in this 2-year time frame, 2-3 year time frame we were looking at. So that's part of the story. But the other part of the story, well, Jen, I've been going on and on. You probably have something to say here. So
I guess maybe just sharing some of what we learned from the interviews. So one of the interviewees flagged early on in June of last year some of the problems they'd had with ultra cold distribution chains in Africa in particular. And they said that on several occasions, they had a research collaboration with a research center in Cameroon, for example, and everything would go fine until the plane hit the ground. And then they had to try several times to successfully get that material to the research partner. And so they said they were concerned that that might become a problem with vaccine distribution globally, and that was prescient. It's something that we've sadly observed. But one of the things I'd also like to share is we heard a number of stories from the interviewees in relation to the manufacturing efforts about a willingness to try new things, right? A willingness also to prioritize COVID and dedicate facilities and production lines and put 100 people in a specific place working 7 days a week, night and day shifts to really get the production processes in place, optimize them, address problems as they arose on the production line, et cetera. So people were really taking a big risk and incurring some cost to move resources to really focus and get that going. There was a different way of interacting with regulators, for example, and the process for developing manufacturing processes was compressed. And that was done alongside seeking regulatory approval in a number of cases, which was novel. Right? Instead of making the batch they needed for phase 1 clinical trials, then making a little bit more for phase 2, et cetera, they compressed it and were seeking ways to scale right away. So we saw a number of innovations in that respect. But yeah, again, there have been problems with distribution, admittedly. Whether patents are the problem is another question. What we saw as of August 1st were 45 publicly announced tech transfer agreements, tech transfer partnerships for manufacturing. Recently, I saw data that indicated there's over 360 in place today. So as the governments and funders and others are prioritizing the extension of these networks for manufacturing, what it looks like to me based on those numbers, and this is borne out in our report as well, is that companies are sharing knowledge. They are transferring technology. The patents and trade secrets protection is enabling them to do that. And that's happening quite rapidly in many parts of the world.
So Lee, this is all a long-winded way of kind of going into your question in more depth, I guess, which is, and it's interesting. So, because I think the patents get the rap for it, and we obviously don't want to believe that, but actually this is all quite compelling. Regulation and infrastructure seem to have been a significant issue in terms of developing countries. I mean, I've been on a few panels on this, so I've been interestingly never been trolled before on Zoom, but you get trolled on this topic quite rightly because people are very strongly about it. I don't mind it because it's quite difficult to focus when you get all kinds of rude stuff in the comments. But actually, I absolutely, it's essential to hear the other side of it. And one of the comments that came out, which I thought was quite interesting in terms of lessons to learn and going forwards, and this is super nerdy IP stuff, so apologies, is the TRIPS aspect of this. And I think some people who are trying to blame the patent system for the whatever failures there may or may not have been over the last 2 years are actually really more angry with how TRIPS has not completely delivered in terms of its promises to developing countries. And I wonder if those two things have become conflated. That's mega nerdy. That's as nerdy as I'm going to get.
Oh my gosh, I can go so much more nerdy on that than you. You can't imagine.
Nerd's going to be out-nerded.
Yes, throw you on the mat. I'll get really nerdy on TRIPS. No, I live in Geneva, right? Like this is the center of the TRIPS waiver debate. And certainly there's disappointment. The bargain was put in place these IP protections and technology will flow, research money will flow to your countries. And we know that there's many factors other than having a sophisticated IP framework in place that affect that process. And people do feel frustrated. What's interesting is that the TRIPS waiver proposal was put on the table before we actually knew what was happening with the IP landscape around the COVID vaccines. we certainly could see the landscape around the pre-existing technologies, the background IP, but nobody really knew who was filing what, et cetera, until last fall/winter. And now we're seeing, we've got a recent report by WIPO showing the patent landscape in relation to COVID vaccines and therapeutics. We have more information, but it does seem, I would agree with you, it does seem to me like an extension of this frustration with TRIPS overall.
Yeah, to get even more perhaps nerdy about it, it's the frustration with TRIPS is part of a bigger picture. With frustration with the World Trade Organization, which TRIPS is part of, and what the wealthy countries wanted out of the WTO in large part was protection for their IP around the world, harmonization, because that's what we make. We're up the value chain, and that's where a lot of our wealth lies now is in intangibles. And developing countries signed on because they believe they get greater access to our markets for agricultural goods and other things. And there was a promise that, if you sign on now and you sign on to TRIPS, you've been resisting stronger IP rights for decades, developing countries, but sign on to TRIPS. And as part of the WTO package, you're going to get greater access to our markets. It hasn't really happened. The failed Doha round of negotiations in the early 2000s was where that was supposed to happen. It didn't. And I remember an occasion where I was at the World Intellectual Property Organization, and there was something quite controversial going on. The talks were stalled. Everything was framed in terms of intellectual property rights. But one of, I think, maybe the UK delegates told me privately that the Brazilian delegates had spoken to them and said, look, you aren't going to get what you want here until we get what we want across town. And what he was speaking in terms of Geneva, the World Intellectual Property Organization, is a couple miles from the WTO. So the Brazilian delegate was essentially saying, look, you need to deliver on your overall promises about what this new world trading order was supposed to bring us if you want to continue to make progress on IP rights. So there's definitely, I think there's a strong argument, by the way, that countries should adopt stronger IP rights for the benefit of their own citizens and innovators and industries. But when you're talking to a trade minister, when you're talking in Geneva, intellectual property becomes a bargaining chip. And I think that's part of the frustration here is they didn't get, many countries feel they didn't get what they were supposed to with respect to trade, and IP was part of that package. So they're going to withhold that chip. They're going to be very angry about that chip until they get the other things that they feel they were promised.
So I did hear a lot from our interviews, if I can just say, about the implications of the waiver. Without us raising it during our interviews, a lot of people did underline the fact that when they're going to invest in a partnership or a facility, or they're going to engage in tech transfer collaboration, they do pay attention to the IP environment, right? So in a place where there's not solid protection for trade secrets and patents, they would be reluctant, perhaps, to pick the partner in that place. And we also did ask them about one thing, which is, if there was no intellectual property protection, what would happen in the next pandemic? Would you still come forward to address the pandemic and help find solutions? And every company, of course, said yes. However, they would do it differently. So they would be more reluctant to share their trade secrets and patented technology with the partners they had worked with during this pandemic, with other companies, because it would be risky. So they would go as far as they could with their internal resources, internal knowledge, internal solutions. And we may not go as far as quickly as they were able to do in this pandemic. So that would be a limiting factor, not an enabler to set aside IP protection.
And before we get on to the jolly topic of the next pandemic, thank you. There's been a draft knocking around for a few weeks now of a potential paper from the Quadrilateral in relation to the waiver, which is quite interesting. The quad. All right, there we go.
Yeah, come on, get in with the lingo. It's the quad.
The quad. That sounds like that is just like the Illuminati, isn't it? It's terrifying. And that's quite interesting. If I'm looking at the same thing, I don't know, I can't tell what's a legitimate leak from a fake leak. I'm not a journalist, but this is the one that talks about authorizing the use of the patented subject matter for the production and supply of COVID-19 vaccine. So I guess this is the paper that's going to be appearing before presented to the. Okay, we don't know.
Yeah,
but
we don't know.
interesting. It was interesting because it's written. I mean, it's IP savvy. This document suggests, which gives it some legitimacy for sure. It's very interesting that I don't think anyone's actually. This shows the disparity between the debate about patents have been really bad for the for getting the vaccine out versus what the actual kind of experts are talking about, because this talks about basically releasing or simplifying the compulsory license right, isn't it, basically, in relation to the enabling technology for making vaccines. So actually, it's not really about, I think everyone thinks, you patented the vaccine, you're not stopping people using it. As you say, Mark and Jennifer, actually, it's not. It's about, a lot of this was about the tech that was already there and bringing 50 years worth of research to a head really, really quickly. This document just basically says, we'll allow people to use the enabling technologies. That was the first thing, which I thought was interesting. They understand the debate. The actual debate the politicians are having is just completely wrong, basically, I think. But the other one that did worry me, actually, was a lot of stuff in this about stopping abuse. Most of it's about actually kind of ensuring that when it gets into third-party hands, the stuff goes to where it should go. And that was actually quite a sad kind of political feel to the whole thing. There's some kind of nasty realities about making sure that materials go where they're supposed to go. How real is this document? Am I just reading a made-up thing off the internet?
It hasn't been formally endorsed by the Quad necessarily yet, but it's floating around certainly, and people have opinions on it. I think on one hand, people are saying that it doesn't go far enough, precisely because it doesn't include trade secrets.
Right.
As we've been discussing, they're so important. At the same time, others seem to feel that it's a good compromise. Probably the fact that there's a lot of different negative opinions about it means it's a decent compromise, but it really confirms the compulsory licensing provisions that are already in TRIPS, more or less writ large, let's say. But it does only apply to vaccines, and that's another point of contention, is some parties feel it should extend also to diagnostics and therapeutics. So we have to wait and see what the members decide on that.
I'll hand it back to Lee.
Oh, cheers, mate. I wasn't expecting that. I thought you were on a roll.
I'm on a roll, but every roll comes to an end.
Where shall I take us next?
Next is actually good, isn't it? I think the next pandemic worries me.
Yeah, so I think you touched on this, Jennifer, earlier, but let's put ourselves in the position. I'm quite worried about where the UK government might go with this. We have a government that does tend to swing whichever way it thinks that the popular mood is. So I'm quite confident that at some point this week it's going to do a U-turn on the vaccine patent waiver and say that it's for it. So let's move on a pandemic, like Gwilym says. Let's think about the next one. If we set the precedent this time round that we can suspend IP rights because we think they're a blocker, where does that put us next time?
So that's what the companies told us, is they would come forward to help, of course, but in a different way. And it would feel much more risky to put everything on the table in order to find solutions together, optimize manufacturing processes, et cetera. So they would be reluctant to share their most valuable knowledge and technology with others. And I mean, one company we spoke with gave us numbers. They said, look, once we had the vaccine, we would be able to manufacture less than 500,000 doses using our existing capacity. Obviously, that wasn't going to cut it. So we went out, scoured the globe. We looked at 100 different potential partners. We chose 9, and we engaged in a very rapid and intensive tech transfer process to bring them into our manufacturing network. So you would get a response. Would it be as robust and rapid as the one we just saw? Probably not. And that's the dangerous thing about the proposals to set aside IP protection. What do you think, Mark?
I also worry about the early stages. So actually, right as the pandemic was beginning, I was finishing a different research project where I was looking at the role of venture capital and how it responds to the strength of IP systems. That was U.S. focused. But I was interviewing innovators and investors, and I happened to interview somebody who turned out to be very relevant to the pandemic that was about to start. I talked to Dr. Derek Rossi, who is the academic founder of Moderna, one of the pioneers with respect to mRNA science. And you know, when I spoke to him, we talked about the importance of patents to developing, to moving stuff out of the lab, basic research out of the lab and into companies. And Rossi always said, that look, it's the great science that matters. Science, science, science. Why? He's a scientist and he believes in it. And he's an amazing scientist. And even talking to him for an hour, I felt like I was robbing humanity of an hour he could have spent doing something more important than talking to me. He started 5.
Oh, I know that feeling.
His research, yes, exactly. His research has started 5 biotech companies. But what he said is you have to understand that, nothing happens without investment. And it's in the commercial sector where there's the expertise about taking stuff from the lab and turning it into treatments from patients. And he talked about how there's this whole ecosystem at every step along the way. There are scientists that work in turning things into treatments for patients. There are regulatory experts within these companies. There's manufacturing and distribution experts. And he said the idea that you could just have, say, the government develop this all, or that once the research in the lab's done, we have a treatment, he said is really just, it's ridiculous because, academic researchers want to do academic research. They're not going to, deliver 8 billion doses to humanity. They've got a nice small lab somewhere with test tubes and lab equipment. They don't have industrial manufacturing equipment. And so we need the investment driven by patents. And now what you have is a very risky industry where venture capitalists understand when they invest in a small company like Moderna or BioNTech, they're probably going to lose their money. Most of the time they do, but they can tolerate that risk because sometimes there's a success. But if that success results in that investment being taken away because their IP rights are being taken away, then there's really no reason to invest. You lose, tails you lose, heads you lose. It's sort of a coin flip. You're going to lose either way. And so where does the money go? The money flows into other safer investments. And that's actually what my research was showing, was that more venture capital dollars relatively were flowing as the IP system in the US weakened a bit. More venture capital dollars were flowing into lifestyle brands, food and beverage, luxury clothing, at the relative expense of the life sciences.
Where the investment was safer.
Yeah. The investment goes where it's safer. So make the investment less safe, you're going to get fewer startups.
But your question is not theoretical, right? Like there's negotiations that will be starting soon on a pandemic preparedness treaty. And certainly one area that will be on the, one topic that will be on the table is to what extent the treaty should have provisions about IP management in it. So the lessons learned from, the experience we've just gone through, innovation overall, what Mark is talking about, which aligns with the first third of our analysis that looks at the pre-existing technologies and how they got there. Why did people invest to develop them? Why were they ripe to use at the moment when the pandemic started? Lucky for us, right? Like these are questions that will that are very practical issues that will be on the table in those negotiations at WHO.
So, and everything you've said to me is eminently sensible. Kind of all lands, all registers. How do we, the IP system, get this across to policymakers? How do we land it with them?
By avoiding really high level, bland talking points and getting down to the nuts and bolts and real world examples and stories and explanations that bring these issues to life. That's my opinion.
Oh, I agree. And I have some academic colleagues who thought that they should speak out on this issue. A few who are on the who believe in the patent system, but they tend to say things like the importance of innovation to investment without having any concrete stories. And I'm surprised sometimes when I see some of the big pharma companies kind of using these same abstract, bland talking points. The talking to people who are actually doing the work, talking to people who actually make investments, talking to those people. That's the kind of research I like doing because it results in ways of communicating the importance of IP. So yeah, we've got to be talking to policymakers and telling them these stories, relating my conversation with Derek Rossi and why IP helped get the mRNA technology out of his lab and into a company and eventually into patients' arms, talking to manufacturing experts like we did, who tell us why it's not as simple as so many people seem to think. And, bless that guy for taking a half hour out of his probably 14-hour days to talk to us, because he had been working nonstop since the pandemic started to manufacture vaccines and knew it wasn't easy.
Mm-hmm. The success, there are many successes over the last 2 years. It's not all gone perfectly. And one, I think that in terms of, the story to pass on, I think, Jennifer, you mentioned this, the 360 plus collaboration agreements, is that for some reason or other, everybody just realized that collaborating without government pressure, without an obvious route to monetization, based on vast amounts of trust, underpinned by IP, actually gave rise to the ability to get from the lab to the arm, as it were, and the vast number of steps in between. And I mean, that must be one of the biggest lessons of all, is to set up a framework that encourages and facilitates that collaboration, but maybe doesn't fiddle too much with the entrepreneurial kind of freedom and the adventure of the whole thing, because it's incredible what they did.
Well, there's some really good things going on now in terms of creating the frameworks for collaboration. Look at the mRNA hub, right, in South Africa. WHO is now also sponsoring the creation of a training hub in Korea, where people can come and be trained on the basics of biomanufacturing. This speaks to this notion that in order to learn, you need to be working side by side with an expert who will share their knowledge, teach you basically how to do what needs to be done in this area of developing and making new vaccines, biologics, monoclonal antibodies, et cetera. But I think you're right. People are realizing that that's how that happens. That's how that technology and knowledge flows, working side by side with a partner.
Right. There are some things we could fix for the next pandemic, if you want to talk about that. There's some things we could do better, certainly. But I don't think it's the IP system that was the problem here. And in a lot of ways, the problem is that the IP system's so easy to talk about in lovely conference rooms by the lake in Geneva. And some of the other problems are much more complicated and harder and involve people who actually know things, like engineers and supply chain experts and manufacturing experts that don't have time to come to conference rooms and pontificate.
Yeah, it was interesting when we did the interviews to hear the things that were concerning people, or the way they had rolled up their sleeves and done things. Like, we heard examples about the incredible stresses on supply chains, including last summer when we were still doing the interviews. Things like, a filter that you need to replace in your bioreactor for every production run, instead of taking 4 to 6 weeks to get to people, is taking 60 to 65 weeks estimate to deliver to the clients. And as a result, companies were nervous. They were starting to buy more than they needed. More pressure on the supply chain. We saw bad trade policies. We see, tariffs on inputs and equipment, like the plastic bags you need to run the bioreactor. We see a lot of different areas of policy that need to be right in order for all of this to come together, right? Not just IP. There's a lot of different areas. Regulatory has already been mentioned. So we need to really look at this holistically.
So the research took us to a point in time, 1st of August 21, and that's 8 months ago now. It's extraordinary, isn't it? The pandemic's over in the UK. There isn't 15, 20% of the population with COVID currently, and we don't have 200 people dying a day or any of these things that we just don't report anymore. Do you think the research is done? Is there more you could look at, or has it reached a natural conclusion?
Oh, there's more to be done, certainly. Come on. Mark, in our free time, we should update this.
If I wanted to do hard work like that, I'd still be billing hours, not being a professor. But no, it was well worth it. And there are more interesting things to look at and see, both looking to the future, to how to develop the system better, and also understanding how the development of biological treatments has changed what we understand about the life sciences industry. It used to be a pretty simple model, and IP played a key role, but it was kind of a discrete role where that treatments were synthesized, small molecule drugs were synthesized by a really simple, well-known process and manufactured by a well-known process, and the innovation went into finding something new. With biologics, everything can be innovative, from determining how to develop the treatment, where you build an entirely new technology platform, to finding the treatment, to manufacturing. And there's a lot more collaboration. And actually, IP is more important than ever and more complex than ever in its relationship with this industry. And that's something we learned too, to just the old model where, a company had a patent on a new treatment, and that was probably the most important thing, except for some more follow-on patents that held by that company. And that was what was key to bringing a treatment to market. That's over now. These mRNA vaccines, there are so many different people, entities, and people who contributed to this technology and bringing them to market. It requires a lot more collaboration. And I think that's an interesting story to tell going forward. And I don't think our premises in terms of making policy about the life sciences and the role of IP in the life sciences, or our laws, are quite ready for that yet. We need to understand better just how much more complex this world has become.
I think also an area that deserves further attention, and this is borne out by this recent patent landscape published by WIPO, is the role of universities and research centers, and the importance of handoff from those kinds of actors to the companies that can further develop the promising technologies and treatments. I noticed that they found 44% of the patents filed that they examined were from universities and research centers. That's interesting. I'd like to know more about that. So I think there's a lot of topics that we could go into if you guys want to fund that.
What? or any listeners, yes. So
I'd like to do, Lee, I'd like to do another podcast actually on Mark's prior research. Well, now we've just touched on that. As the US becomes arguably a bit less IP friendly, the shift away from innovation and investment in innovation. That's definitely a different podcast.
Sounds like a good one to me, mate.
I suspect, Jennifer, but you've got a whole bunch of research we need to do. You've got a whole series of podcasts here. Definitely.
But
so many podcasts.
But
if we could get together and do one in a pub, though, I think that would.
We've done that.
Even more
yeah, we've done one of those. It got a bit messy, to be fair.
I imagine, yes.
But no. If you find yourself over here, then we can absolutely make that happen. Or maybe we could come over to you.
It's good to get Lee into a pub for an hour to take that away from him burdening society with it. So it's similar, Mark, to your position, but not quite the same.
Indeed.
Gwilym.
Yes, Lee.
We're at about close. We're going to need to draw it to a close. You got any more questions for our guests?
Oh, I wrote those down. Yeah, how come you guys collaborated?
Oh, me and Mark?
Yeah.
Oh, because we wrote a paper a couple of years ago on women and IP. Yeah, right? Definitely. I'd love that. Looking at why women, all things equal, use IP rights less than men and how to deal with that problem. We were looking for best practices, and sadly, we didn't find any proven best practices yet. But since then, I've done a lot in this area, and I loved working with Mark on that. And so when I thought of doing this project, he's the first person I called, and it was a pleasure.
And we're old friends, and Jen is an amazing person. So it was a pleasure to work with her.
Yeah, you both coming across pretty amazing, I'd say.
Yeah, it's been an absolute thrill. It really has.
Oh my gosh, we're closing the podcast with a love fest. Thank you.
Yeah. We always do that. No, actually, we always close the podcast with a totally unrelated question. As it's been quite a serious gig, this one, I'm thinking that we ought to go somewhere nice and safe and cozy. So I'll ask Gwilym first. It's the Easter break next couple of weeks.
It is.
What nice, relaxing thing have you got planned?
I'm going to sleep, Lee. I've got a podcast. People may know I've got a small baby. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to go and put headphones on and a pillow on my head, and I'm going to go and find a dark room and hide, and I'm going to sleep.
Yeah, you're getting at both ends, though, aren't you? Because you've got young baby and late teenage daughter.
Yeah, they both woke me up in the middle of the night last night. One crying and one stumbling in from the pub. It's awful.
Go on then, Jen. What are you going to do? What's your go-to relaxation for the next week or two?
So I don't have a small baby, so I'm going to go to Morocco and kite surf.
Wow.
Yes.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, with my girls. My girls are 7 and 13.
Why Morocco? Is that a great kite surfing spot?
Yeah, Dakhla in Morocco is a nice kite surfing spot. So I'm taking my girls and we're going to go do some kite surfing next week. It's going to be great.
Amazing.
Have you been to Morocco before?
Yes, but not to Dakhla.
Oh, cool. So you know that when they put a monkey on your shoulder, you say no, thank you, and don't start letting them take photos and asking for money. Some of those irritating things I remember from Morocco.
So that's a whole nother podcast, because actually I petted the monkey when that happened and it bit me. And the guy ran out with a vaccination certificate for the monkey to assuage my concerns.
See, that's why you need vaccines. Waivers, that might not happen. There we go. Full circle. Good grief.
Oh my gosh.
Mark, no pressure, but you got to follow that.
Oh, well, I no monkeys, but I'm off to a conference in San Diego, then spending some extra time there. It's very sunny there, and it's good because our weather in Akron, Ohio is kind of a mixture of like Norwegian winters and Irish summers. So seeing some sunlight is quite welcome at this point in after the long winter. So I'm looking forward to it, and drinking beer at various microbreweries and seeing the beach and doing things like that. So it should be quite fun.
Great.
Lee?
Oh, no, I thought I was going to get away with it.
No, you never do.
Well, so Gwilym's got young children, or young child now. I've got lots of grandchildren. I know I don't look old enough, but I've got lots of grandchildren. And they've reached...
You do.
Cheers, mate. They've just reached the age where they're starting to get an interest in things like fishing. So I've got a couple of weeks planned where we're just going to go on to various beaches around the south coast of the UK and do a spot of fishing. And that'll be it for me. So I'm doing genuinely sedate, kind of gentle stuff.
Sounds perfect.
No kite surfing. I will see kite surfers because they do it quite a lot around the south coast, but I will not be doing any. Well, thank you both for coming on. It really has been an absolute pleasure. Gwilym's right. We're going to have to get you back to talk about some other stuff. I am quite interested in the women in an IP thing, because we did do a podcast about a year ago, Gwilym, on women in IP, and it would be kind of timely to follow that one up. So that might be
would be great to do. I mean, with WIPO, I've been doing a lot to get this on the international agenda. So, what they're doing, get this on the kind of on the radar of the IP offices, chief economists. How do you measure, baseline and measure progress over time and addressing this problem?
Don't say too much.
Tons.
That's a teaser. That's a teaser. That's enough for the next podcast. Thank you both so much for coming on. You've been amazing guests. Gwilym, I'll see you on the next one.
Looking forward to it. Lovely to meet you all.